Good morning. I'm Victoria Marsick, and I would like to share a few stories from my work with Jack Mezirow. I met Jack when I was a student, actually, a master's student, and I was working with a group called World Education in New York City. And Jack was a consultant to World Education. And so I got to know him that way, he and Edie both. And in particular, he was working with adult basic education and literacy education. I had been doing some work with World Education with Thailand, where they were experimenting with an interesting approach to developing literacy that respected the idea of what they called the kit pan man, who was somebody who could think and be. So it's quite an innovative and different approach to thinking about what adult literacy ought to be about. And I was working in the Philippines with the rural reconstruction movement, where they had an empowering approach to helping people in villages that enabled people to really take more charge of their lives. And Jack was a consultant to both of those projects, so I got to know him pretty well because I ended up being a resident advisor, or I wouldn't call it an advisor, but a program officer. I had gone to Thailand to help with a workshop in the Philippines, and they asked if I could stay and help. And I said, well, if I ask my office that, they'll say no, but if you ask my office that, they'll say yes. So I was living on the ground, and I worked with Jack, among other people. So I got to know him pretty well. And when I came back to the United States for my own graduate study, I asked him a lot about where I should study and with whom. I could have come to Teachers College, but his mentors were all in California, and he had spent some time there as a faculty member working with community development programs. So he introduced me to grounded theory. He had met Barney Glaser and particularly Anselm Strauss, and he also knew other people there. So I took courses with Barney and with Anselm in grounded theory. And it was because I was able to understand the grounded theory approach that Jack invited me to participate in the women's reentry study, which everybody knows, in which he had been looking really at the program curricula of community colleges. That's what the grant was all about. And not only community colleges, but higher education, where reentry programs were set up, and where he discovered that a key feature of those programs was, in fact, a process that was akin to consciousness raising. He was very influenced by Paulo Freire, and he saw consciousness raising in these programs, or conscientization, because he was also very influenced, as everybody knows, by his wife Edie, who had herself gone back to school. This was the era of Betty Friedan, and many of the programs knew about that, reflected that, and were engaged either in embracing it or in some cases feeling that it wasn't necessarily the right thing for them. But because of my own living in California and my ability to use grounded theory and to go to the places where in the Northern California area close to where I was, to do interviews and do observations, et cetera, I got engaged in that project. So I was there from the ground up. And it was a very exciting period of time. I feel that, in retrospect, that in many ways, Jack got kind of captured by this idea of perspective transformation. He actually didn't, to my knowledge, there weren't that many direct interviews with women, so it never started out as an interview study of the women themselves. It really started out as interviews with administrators of programs, many of whom themselves had been reentry women. But it was more the perspective on the curriculum. Yet the seeds of perspective transformation were there, and it is to his credit that he saw those and was able to bring those out and to develop that theory that we're all working with today. So that's my story of some of the origins around that theory. I also want to share a story that has more to do with the first conference. By that time, I had finished my doctorate at Berkeley, and I was working with UNICEF. So when the position in adult education faculty came open, I competed for it and I was able to get that job. So that's why I'm here. But I was at TC as an assistant professor when Jack had the idea of having this conference. In fact, I just had a conversation about this with Alexis Kokos. And Alexis asked me the question, well, when Jack convened everybody, what was his purpose? Was he really trying to get people to look at his theory, or did he have a broader purpose in mind? And I can say with honesty that I think he had a broader purpose in mind. But of course, he was certainly interested in sharing what he had come up with, but he wanted to create an environment where people who were interested in this work might come together. And as I have said in the opening to this conference, in fact, he didn't really expect that many people to come. He said, this is a conference that really is to convene people who are interested in building theory as well as doing research in this area and contributing to practice. But I don't think there are probably that many people around who are interested in such thing. Maybe 25 or 50 people max would come. So he was completely blown away by the number of people who were interested. And the spirit of the conference was one of egalitarianism, I would say, for a couple of reasons. One of them is that many people in the field who you will recognize were there. Ed Taylor had come to that conference. I think John Dirks did also. Patricia Cranton, Bob Keegan, Larry Delos, Mary Belenke. So it was a meeting where people genuinely had deep conversations about what transformative learning is, how is transformative learning different from transformation theory, and things, because of Mary Belenke in particular, that had to do with the gendered questions around the theories that were being developed. We were not that much. I would not say that anybody really there represented people of color or diverse perspectives internationally or anything of that sort. But out of the conference grew the idea that by convening every year or every other year, we could create a space for these conversations to occur. So I have to attribute the collegial nature of the conference and the hope to spend as much time in community building and community engagement with people, as well as kind of a home for this kind of theory building. That idea, in large part in terms of the design, came from two graduate students who were here at the time. Many of you may have known Colleen Wiesner, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. And you probably would not have met Nancy Fall, but these two women were doctoral students at the time. And it was because of their influence that the conference was set up more in terms of dialogue opportunities, a sort of flatter, more networked structure. Papers were important, ideas were important, no question, but also the idea that if we were to build this in order to build theory, that we needed to use it as an opportunity to capture what people were saying, to do research on it, and to use the fruits of what came out of it reflectively to kind of share then, so what's new now? So from it, for example, Ed Taylor, who was at Penn State, Jack knew that, I'm sure they had conversations around this, Ed Taylor was one of the key contributors to the idea, it was his idea, that perspective transformation didn't have to resonate only from an aha moment or a sort of sudden disjuncture, but it could be something that would be incremental over time, because Ed picked this from his own experience with international work where that was the case. So he and Jack said, well, Ed, why don't you be the person who, or either Ed offered, I'm not sure, or Jack invited, but in any case, out of that collaboration and conversation grew the idea that Ed would periodically create these, what do we know from research papers. We also had in the early conferences, and certainly in the first one, opportunities for people with mutual interests. For example, people who are working in higher ed or people who are working in the community or in the workplace to gather and to be able to talk with one another about how does this apply in our setting. So I wanted to share those thoughts for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to be around in the early days of the conference, to kind of capture a little of the flavor of that first meeting. I remember in particular Larry Delos, who in some ways became part of our spirit guide for those early conferences. Larry, as many of you may know, lives on an island now in the Northwest and does retreats and has gotten very involved, which he always was, in environmental kinds of activities. But Larry would offer from his strengths wisdom and spiritual ideas that touched not religion but the spirit that was inspirational to all of us. So the conferences were rich, the conferences are still rich, and I hope you have a little more of a window into that early conference. Thank you.